David Whitfield wakes up at 6:12 in the morning in the same house he has lived in for 9 years on a quiet street in a suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, where the driveways are narrow and the lawns are always slightly overdue for mowing. He is 38 years old, a systems manager at a mid-sized logistics company, and he has spent the last 14 years of his life doing almost everything right. He pays his bills on time, he has a decent 401k, he drives a 2016 Honda Accord with cloth seats that have started to fray near the driver's headrest, a car he bought used and has kept running through nothing but stubbornness and regular oil changes. His wife, Rachel, teaches 3rd grade at the elementary school 2 miles away, and together they are raising 2 kids, a boy named Eli, who is obsessed with dinosaurs, and a girl named Mia, who has just started asking why they don't have a bigger house like her friend Emma. David is not a flashy man. He wears the same 3 button-down shirts on rotation, drinks his coffee black because he never got around to buying oat milk, and spends his Saturday mornings mowing that overdue lawn while listening to sports radio through a cracked phone speaker. But there is a version of David that exists only in his imagination, one that surfaces every time he sits at a red light next to a black Mercedes-Benz or watches a BMW glide past him on the highway. It is not envy, exactly. It is something quieter and more persistent, a low hum of longing that has followed him since he was 22 years old, sitting in the passenger seat of a friend's father's Lexus, running his hand along the leather and thinking, someday this will be me. For 16 years, someday never came. There was always something more urgent. A wedding, a mortgage, a baby, a recession that quietly erased a chunk of his savings the year Eli was born. David is the kind of man who has learned to postpone his own wants in favor of everyone else's needs, and if you asked him, he would tell you he was fine with that. Mostly, he was. Then, in March, everything changes. David's company is acquired by a larger firm, and in the reshuffling that follows, he is promoted to Director of Operations, a role that comes with an $80,000 raise and a signing bonus large enough to make his hands shake slightly when he reads the offer letter twice just to be sure the numbers are real. For the first time in his adult life, David Whitfield has room to breathe. The emergency fund is full, the mortgage feels smaller, and that quiet hum from all those years at red lights suddenly has a voice, and it is telling him that this, finally, is his moment. He drives to the dealership on a Thursday afternoon, telling himself he is only looking. He sits in a dark blue sedan with stitched leather seats and a dashboard that lights up like the cockpit of something built for a different kind of life than the one he's been living. The salesman doesn't even need to sell him. David sells himself, replaying 16 years of waiting in the span of about 90 seconds. He imagines pulling into his driveway. He imagines Rachel's face. He imagines, for reasons he can't quite explain, that this car will somehow confirm that everything he has worked for actually mattered. This is the moment the entire video exists to examine, not because David is wrong to want this, not because luxury cars are inherently foolish purchases, but because this exact moment, the moment right after a financial win, the moment when a person finally has enough, is statistically one of the most dangerous financial junctures in a person's life. And almost nobody sees it coming because it doesn't feel dangerous. It feels like a reward. To understand why, you have to understand what actually happens inside a person's mind in the weeks after a major financial breakthrough. Behavioral economists have a name for what David is experiencing. It's sometimes called arrival syndrome, the belief that reaching a long-anticipated milestone will produce a permanent, stable transformation in how you feel about yourself. The promotion becomes proof, the raise becomes evidence, and the car becomes the physical, drivable symbol that the proof is real. The trouble is that arrival syndrome is built on a psychological illusion, because the feeling of having arrived is temporary by design. This is where hedonic adaptation enters the story, the well-documented tendency of human beings to return to a fairly stable baseline of satisfaction no matter what happens to them, good or bad. Lottery winners report surprisingly quickly returning to their prior happiness levels. People who suffer devastating losses, in many cases, adapt back toward their baseline as well. The luxury car will feel extraordinary for approximately 6 to 8 weeks. Then, quietly, it will simply become the car David drives to work. But here's what makes this moment genuinely dangerous, and it isn't the depreciation curve, though that matters too. It's what the car does to David's identity. Morgan Housel has written about how wealth is fundamentally about what you don't see, the lifestyle you didn't buy, the car you didn't upgrade, the house you didn't outgrow, because those decisions are what allow money to compound in silence. The moment David drives that sedan into his driveway, he isn't just acquiring a vehicle. He's quietly renegotiating his own self-image. He's no longer the guy who drives the practical Accord and invests the difference. He's becoming, in his own mind, a man for whom a luxury car is simply appropriate. And identities once adopted are extraordinarily difficult to walk back because unwinding them doesn't just cost money, it costs pride. There is an old idea in behavioral economics that describes wealth not as a fixed number, but as a moving target that quietly repositions itself every time a person feels they've finally reached it. The moment David believes he is caught up to the life he once imagined, his sense of what enough means shifts a little further out, resetting almost automatically. This isn't a flaw in David's character. It's a structural feature of how people evaluate their own progress, comparing not against where they started, but against wherever their expectations most recently settled. And expectations, once a person tastes something new, tend to settle upward, rarely downward, and almost never on their own. This is identity inflation, and it rarely announces itself. It moves in disguised as small, reasonable next steps. The car needs premium fuel, so David starts filling up at the nicer gas station. The car looks slightly out of place next to the chipped paint on the garage door, so David starts pricing out a new garage door. He notices, almost without meaning to, that his usual weekend jeans look wrong parked next to leather seats, so a few new items make their way into his closet. None of these decisions feel reckless in isolation. Each one seems to cost, relatively speaking, almost nothing. But this is precisely how lifestyle creep operates, not through one catastrophic purchase, but through dozens of small, emotionally justified ones, each calibrated to feel proportionate to the last. It's a slow leak in a tire. You don't notice the flat all at once. You just notice weeks later that something feels off, that the ride isn't as smooth as it used to be, and by then the pressure has been leaking out for so long that it takes real effort to trace the problem back to its source. There's an even more unsettling way to picture it. Imagine stepping onto an escalator that is quietly moving backward while you climb. If you stand still, you fall behind. So you keep walking, faster and faster, and it feels like effort, like progress, like you're finally getting somewhere, when in reality, you're spending enormous energy just to stay roughly where you started. That is what lifestyle inflation does to a rising income. The raise goes up, the spending rises to meet it, and a person can spend an entire career climbing an escalator that never actually delivers them anywhere new. Charlie Munger used to say that the first rule of compounding is to never interrupt it unnecessarily, and this idea applies just as much to identity and habits as it does to a brokerage account. Once David starts upgrading his life to match a new self-image, he isn't just spending $80,000 on a car. He is interrupting a much larger, much quieter form of compounding, the version where his raise flows into index funds and retirement accounts and appreciating assets instead of into a network of new fixed costs, because that's the part almost nobody accounts for. The car itself might cost $70,000 or $80,000, but the car is never really the expense. The car is the entry fee into an entirely new tier of monthly obligations. Insurance premiums rise. Maintenance costs more because European luxury vehicles are not maintained at the corner shop that used to service the Accord for $40 an oil change. The tires alone cost 4 times as much. And once David is the kind of man who drives that car, he starts noticing that the neighborhood feels smaller than it used to. Not because anything about the house has changed, but because his sense of what's appropriate has quietly recalibrated upward. Vacations get slightly nicer. Restaurants get slightly more expensive. Somewhere in year 3, the idea of the local public school starts to feel, to David and Rachel both, like something that no longer quite fits the family they've become, and school tuition enters the monthly budget as though it had always belonged there. This is mental accounting doing its slow, invisible work, the tendency to treat money differently depending on which mental bucket it seems to belong to. The raise felt like found money, disconnected from the careful budgeting David had done for the previous 14 years, and found money is spent with a different, looser hand than earned money. Meanwhile, social comparison quietly recruits new company. David's old friend group, mostly guys from the neighborhood who still drive Accords and Camrys of their own, starts to feel, without anyone saying anything cruel, slightly mismatched. New friendships form around the country club Rachel joined so Mia could take tennis lessons. And these new friends have their own luxury cars, their own vacation homes, their own gravitational pull. Status signaling isn't something David consciously chooses. It's something the environment gently imposes, purchase by purchase, until the man who once felt proud of paying off a Honda in full now feels, quietly, that something is missing if the car in his driveway isn't premium. None of this is a story about greed. It's a story about how ego spending disguises itself as reasonable upgrading, one small step at a time, until a person's fixed monthly costs have grown so large that the raise that was supposed to create freedom has instead created a much more expensive version of the exact same financial pressure David felt before the promotion. He is watering weeds instead of trees, pouring resources into expenses that provide a brief bloom of satisfaction and then die back, requiring more water next season, instead of into investments that grow larger and stronger and require less of him with each passing year. There's a way to picture this that goes beyond spreadsheets and budgets, something closer to physics than finance. Picture a snowball at the very top of a long hill, still small enough to hold in two hands, still early enough that its direction hasn't been decided. A small nudge in one direction sends it rolling toward a slope that gathers mass quietly, almost imperceptibly, for years, before anyone watching would call it impressive. A small nudge in the other direction sends it rolling toward a slope that gathers obligations instead, commitments that feel, at first, just as small and just as harmless as the snow the first snowball is collecting. By the time either snowball is large enough to notice from a distance, its direction was decided long ago at the top of the hill in a moment that felt, at the time, almost too minor to matter. That is what a decision like David's actually is. Not a single choice about a car, but a fork at the top of a very long hill. This is also where opportunity cost quietly enters the story, the cost not of what David spends, but of what that money could have become had it been left alone. $80,000 invested at a long-term historical market average, left untouched for 25 years, doesn't just sit there. It multiplies, patiently, without David having to think about it, without requiring a single additional decision. The tragedy of the purchase isn't the number on the price tag. It's the invisible future version of that number, the one that never gets to exist, the one nobody mourns because nobody ever sees what it would have become. Benjamin Graham spent much of his career trying to teach investors to think in exactly these terms, to weigh not just what something costs today, but what its absence will be worth decades from now. It is a difficult kind of math to feel emotionally because the version of David who benefits from patience is a stranger to him still, a future self he hasn't met yet, competing for resources against a present self who is sitting in a leather seat, engine humming, salesman smiling. So, let's follow two versions of David Whitfield forward in time, because this is where the real lesson lives, not in the moment of the purchase, but in the 15 years that follow it. In the first future, David buys the sedan that Thursday afternoon. The financing feels manageable at first. $490 a month is nothing compared to his new salary. But the insurance jumps by $200 a month. The premium fuel adds another $60. Within 18 months, the garage door is replaced. The kitchen gets a modest renovation because it suddenly looks dated next to the car parked outside it. And the country club membership becomes, in Rachel's words, an investment in the kid's future. Each decision, taken alone, seems defensible. Taken together, David's monthly fixed expenses rise by nearly $3,000 over 4 years. His retirement contributions, which had been scheduled to increase alongside his raises, quietly stay flat because there's always something else that feels more urgent. By year 8, David is earning more money than he ever imagined at 22, and yet he feels, in a way he can't quite articulate to Rachel, more financially fragile than he did the year before the promotion. The car is long since traded in for a newer model because the identity it created has to be maintained, and maintaining an identity is far more expensive than acquiring one. At 53, David runs the numbers one night after everyone is asleep and realizes that despite 15 years of rising income, his net worth has grown only modestly, most of it eaten by a spiral of expenses that each felt small and justified in the moment they were made. In the second future, David leaves the dealership in his old Accord. The disappointment of waiting lingers for a moment, but so does a quiet sense of relief. He tells Rachel they should wait 1 year before making such a big purchase. That 1 year turns into several. Instead of upgrading the car, David maxes out his retirement contributions and automates investments into low-cost index funds. The money isn't exciting like a new car, but it quietly compounds in the background. As Warren Buffett often says, the stock market transfers wealth from the impatient to the patient, and without planning it, David becomes patient. A few years later, an investment opportunity comes from a former colleague. Because he has savings instead of car payments, he can say yes. It works out well. More than a decade after that day at the dealership, David buys an even better luxury car entirely with cash. not to impress anyone, but because he can comfortably afford it. Neither future is unrealistic. The first David isn't irresponsible. He simply lets one purchase raise his standard of living until higher spending becomes normal. The second David isn't a financial genius. He protects the gap between what he earns and what he spends, allowing time and compounding to do the heavy lifting. That was always the real lesson. The mistake was never buying the car. It was allowing one reward to permanently increase monthly expenses. Present day David wanted the excitement of today, while future David needed financial freedom tomorrow, and present David usually wins. Years later, both versions of David are successful, but one is still working because he has to, while the other enjoys retirement with complete peace of mind. The luxury car in his driveway is no longer a symbol of success, it's simply something he could afford after building lasting wealth. The luxury car was never the test. The real test was whether success changed your decisions.